Hi, welcome to another video. It's been several months since I last posted one. Apologies for that. This is going to be a video for CRM data types. I've had it requested multiple times now, going back to sort of 2011, 2013, and now obviously I'm going to be doing this in 2015, but it's all applicable. The same data types exist in all three versions. So we're going to be I've created a custom entity called just data types for clarity of the demonstration, and I'll show you that in a second. And we're going to be designing a plugin that will read and write to the various data types, and I'll show you how to to access the different data types in both late bound and early bound. What it does mean using CRM 2015, because this has only been out since the 17th of November, so it's been about 10 days ago. The version of the SDK that exists at the moment doesn't have a developer toolkit that's compatible, so I'll have to design the plugin from kind of the ground up, referencing the assemblies and then the relevant interface and so on. So we'll go through all of that, and then obviously deploying it using the plugin registration tool. So to start with, I'll show you the entity I've created. So this is the obviously dashboard of CRM 2015 with the new global search and advanced find and so on. So I'll go to the settings area and solutions. So I've created myself a brand new solution using my publisher, CRM developer publisher, and all this contains is my new custom entity. So it's got this data type entity, I've called it, and I've made it visible within the sales area. So what I've done on that, I've got, if I just go to fields and custom, so what you can see is obviously it's alphabetical. I've added a Boolean field called Boolean, a currency field called currency. Obviously it's automatically added this underscore base field because of it being a currency type, and CRM supporting multi-currency, so whatever the system base currency would be, the value would be stored within there, and then if you had a different currency to the base currency, your value would be stored in your custom field. A date and time, so we'll do both of those. Decimal number, floating point number, whole numbers down the bottom, and then we've got a lookup which I've mapped to the contact entity, and then an option set which I've put just three pretty boring options called option 1, 2 and 3. So we'll show you what happens when you read those in, how you actually write it back, and so on. So then I've put those all onto a form. If I go to the sales area and scroll across to my custom entity data types, I do a new. This is how I've done, we've just laid it out on the form. So the default primary field is the name field, which is a single line of text. So that's what I've used rather than creating another new custom field. Then there's our option set, the Boolean, whole number, floating point, decimal, date and time, currency, and I've also brought on the currency lookup field so we can see which currency we're referencing. And then the lookup, which obviously I've put in brackets, contact, because it references the contact entity. So what we'll start by doing is we'll populate these with some sample data. I'll just pick one of the options. We'll just leave the Boolean as yes for this. 1, 2, 3, 4. I think I've set an actual range on that of 0 to 100. So obviously the client side, it's thrown a warning that we won't be able to save the record because it's got to be between 0 and 100. So just edit that. These are the floating point decimal. I've just left them at the defaults, which I think is quite a large number for both. So just put anything in here. And then date, I'll just pick a date, say the 3rd of December. My regional formatting doesn't look quite right, it looks American. Date and time, do the 4th at 10 AM. Currency, it's defaulted to the system currency, or in your personal options you can choose your preferred currency type. For my environment I've just got pound sterling and euros installed, so I could pick euro, which obviously the default for the organisation is pound sterling, but I could pick a different currency, and then obviously the currency symbol will be the euro symbol. But I'll go back to pound sterling as I'm in England. So just put any amount of money in. Obviously you can put more beyond the second DP, and it will obviously round it. So that's rounded down. Obviously it's lost the detail now. If I put 5, 6, it's rounded up by a penny. And then I'll have to add a contact, because I haven't got any data in this system at the moment. Just bring in the quick create form up at the top. Slowly but surely. Okay, so I'll put myself in. That'll do. So we've populated all of the different data type fields, and I can now save that back. That's now saved. So if I go back to the data types, we should see my test name, obviously that's the primary field, and all those values are populated. So now we need to obviously start to build our plugin that we can read in the values and write back. We'll do some test reads and writes. Well, we'll read in the values and then we'll overwrite some of them using both late bound and early bound methods. So I need to create a new solution in Visual Studio, and I'm using Visual Studio 2013. So if I click on that and let it load, so then we need to click New Project. You'll see that I've got Dynamics CRM because I've got the Developer Toolkit installed for 2013, but that obviously won't function and deploy to 2015. So I'm just going to design a standard class library. So I can call the name of it, I'll just call it CRM 2015 plugin. I can call the solution, I'll just put solution on the solution name. So that's just in my default documents folder. So if I OK that, it will create the empty solution with the single project for the class library. And we now need to reference the SDK assemblies. I have got a copy of I think it's only the preview version of the SDK, so I'm not sure how up to date these assemblies are. So what I'm going to do is use the manage NuGet or Nugget packages off Microsoft, do a search for CRM 2015, and these should hopefully be, well, looking at the dates, they may not even be the release date ones, so they may be the same as the SDK, but I'll use these anyway because then they can auto update when new versions are released. But if I look for Microsoft Dynamics CRM 2015 SDK core assemblies, you'll see on the right it contains the XRM SDK DLL and the CRM SDK proxy DLL. So if I click on install and OK, it will download that, and I have to accept the license, and it will add those references. So that's now got the green tick. I can close that. If I expand references, we can see XRM SDK, which is obviously required for plugins, and then the CRM SDK proxy, which gives us some of the older message types, which we won't require. So it's added a default class library called class 1, but I'm going to delete that because we can just create another new one with a more suitable name. Or we could have just renamed it, but if I add, either click on class at the bottom or new item and pick class, but I'll just click on class, give it a suitable name. So we'll just call it CRM data types. Add that. Make the access modifier public, and then after the name of the class, if we do a colon and I plugin, which is the interface we need to implement for a plugin. Obviously it's squiggly underlined because it doesn't understand the namespaces that we've referenced here have I plugin within them. If I right click it and resolve, because we've got the reference added to the solution, it knows it's able to resolve that, and we can click on using and it will add the statement at the top. I've got the Telerik just code installed, which can tidy those up a little bit, or you can do it manually, but I can do this just refactor and organize and add missing usings, and it will just reorder them a bit neater rather than the Microsoft one bit at the top, but doesn't make any difference to functionality. So we've declared the class, we've implemented we've referenced the iPlugin interface. We now need to implement that interface. So if we right click on the name, implement interface, and then choose implement interface, it will add the single method that we need to in order to agree with the contract for the interface. We need to have the execute method, which has a parameter type iService provider passed in, and from that service provider we can get the context and the service factory, and then the organization service, which is the web service we're going to use to actually read and write to the data type entity. So we can delete that throw new not implemented exception. What I'll do as well, sorry, before I go too far, I'll zoom this in a little bit because I'm conscious I'm doing this at 1080p and some of you may not be able to read it correctly, so if I zoom that into 125%, hopefully that's a little bit clearer for most of you. So first thing we need to do is declare either the iPlugin execution context or the iService factory, but it doesn't matter which order we do these in. So context, iPlugin execution context, service provider, so that's the context of the plugin that's passed in. So then we can declare the iOrganization service factory, and we'll use the service factory to get the organization service itself. So service factory, and we cast again to an organization service factory type, service provider dot get service, type of iOrganization service factory, and then we use that service factory to generate the iOrganization service. Again, we cast it, service factory dot create organization service, and then we need to specify a user for which the plugin will execute the context of. So we can just say context dot user ID. So the currently calling user of the plugin will be the context for which the organization service will be called. If you don't understand that, what that means is that any updates and so on we do or retrieves will be in the context of this user, which obviously then or whoever that user is, their roles would be applicable, so they may not be able to retrieve certain records, or when they write records back, the ownership will be this user, this system user's ID. So those are we have the organization service now, so then we can do some sort of basic checks on the message type. We can do some basic checks now to ensure that the context of the plugin has been registered correctly. So if it was registered on the wrong entity, we wouldn't want it to continue because obviously it would throw exceptions. So we can just say if context dot primary entity name does not equal, and then my entity's name, if I go to settings and solutions, open my solution, expand entities and click on my data type entity. I was a bit quick for it. You can see mine's got my prefix STEG for Steve Green, and then underscore data type. So within this code, we can say if it doesn't equal that, then we want the plugin to return because it's been registered incorrectly. So we can just do a simple, if it doesn't equal that entity name, just do a return. We could also check for the message type, but we're going to do this on both a create and an update. So we can go create new ones and it will trigger, and we can obviously step into the code and have a look at it, the retrieved messages, as well as obviously we can go back and subsequently update it. What I will have to do is possibly create an entity image. The reason being that we've got many attributes. If I go back to my entity, open, if we only update a single one of these fields, when we just do the save, the update will only contain the changed value. So if I was to change the boolean, for example, from yes to no, hit save down there, the only value that would be passed across in the update message would be the boolean, because it's the only thing that's been updated. So in order to be able to read all of them every time, we will either use a pre-entity image, or we could use a retrieve, but it's a bit inefficient. So probably a pre-entity image would be the best way, and I'll show you how to set that up in the plugin registration tool. But in order to read the values out of that pre-entity image, so all the other ones that hadn't been updated, that hadn't altered, but we still want to be able to look at them and reference them in the code, we'll have to add a little bit of logic in here to read out the pre-entity image. So hopefully that's making some sense. It'll make more sense as we go through and I'll show you. So we'll start by declaring a late bound type called entity. So it's an entity type, which represents any entity in CRM as a late bound type. I'm calling it just entity. So then we can do a check on the context input parameters if it contains an object called target, and that target represents the entity that's passed in as part of the message. So if the context input parameters does contain one called target, and that input parameter object is an entity, so we can use the is qualifier. So that will check if it is of that type. It will return true or false based on the type we've specified after the brackets. So if it is an entity and the input parameter contains target, then we can set that late bound type here equal to the target object. Target object as an entity. You could have either done a cast in front like that, but obviously if that isn't of type target, that would throw an exception. The as method, if you can call it a method, if it is an applicable cast, it will obviously work, otherwise it will return null. So you just got to be a little bit careful if you do use as, but because we've already done a check up here to make sure it is an entity type, we know that will cast it as an entity because it's already done that check. So it will return an entity type into that late bound type. Otherwise, so if it's not true that the target object isn't an entity or isn't contained within it, then again we can return, because we can't carry on processing our logic without having this entity with all the variables and stuff to access. I mentioned that obviously we're going to do both late bound and early bound. In order to be able to access the early bound types, we need to generate the early bound type library. It's like a class library that contains all of the early bound types, and that's done by generating the early bound class library using the CRM SVC util that's part of the SDK. So if I change to my SDK folder, so within the bin folder within the SDK you can see this utility CRM svc util.exe, which is a command prompt utility. Oops, excuse me, I can't type. So if I just type that in and hit return, if I can CRM, done it completely wrong, sorry. If I hit return, it will obviously prompt with a load of information of how to declare it, what parameters you need to specify. So you need things like a URL, which is your endpoint for your organization service. If you're going to do it in Visual Basic, obviously the default is C#, so I don't need to specify that. The output file name, I'll probably do it into the bin folder. You could specify a path to another location for that. The namespace for the generated code, so here you can see my namespace is CRM 2015 plugin up there. So if I use the same, I haven't got to do any additional usings to access the namespace of the generated class library, but you can generate whatever namespace you like. Then if you are connecting to an online organization, or in my instance it's local on a virtual server, but I'm not part of the same domain as the virtual server, so I will have to specify username and password. If you're a member of the same domain, your machine was joined to the domain, and your user account had the necessary access to the CRM server, you could skip obviously putting username, password and domain, and it will just authenticate seamlessly with Windows authentication. Service context name, I will generate it, but we're not going to use it's used for the link provider and so on. If you want to do link queries, I think that's probably all we need. So if I start typing it, so CRM svc util, first thing I'll put is the URL, which is my local 2015 server. Whoops. Then the organization name, mine's just called CRM demo. You can get that from settings, customizations, developer resources. So you can see this is what we're trying to type out, is this URL here. So what we could do is click it, copy that out of the address bar. If you're not confident in typing it, delete it back to the URL colon, paste that in. So now we've got the full path from developer resources. So that's the URL. Output file name, I'll just call it CRM 2015 early bound types.cs. Namespace, which if we recall was from here, this CRM 2015 plugin. Again, I can paste that in. Then username, you can do shorthand /u. This is my domain username. I'll have to obviously blank this out. That's my password. Yeah, I did say I'd do the service context name, but it's not really required. Doesn't matter about case, I don't know why I'm doing capitals. And then I can just say CRM 2015 context. That should be it. If I hit return, that will whir away, generating the early bound types. And once it's finished, you should see it say it's output it to the same path that we're in this bin folder, and obviously the output name. Hopefully won't take too long. Okay, so that's finished. Now you can see it's written to that folder and the output name that we specified. So I can minimize that or close the command prompt, go over to my Visual Studio, right click on my project, add existing item, then I can browse to my SDK bin folder, and there's that early bound type class library. Add that in. You see it appear as, obviously you could have put it into a subfolder and so on, but it's part of the project now, and then we can now reference the early bound types. So coming back over to the code we've written so far, we've declared the organization service, we've done some basic checks on the entity name. If it's not the right entity, it returns. We've created an entity late bound type, checked that the input parameter contains a target object and it is of type entity. If it is, we cast it, that target object, to our entity type. So now we could also declare an early bound type, so early bound entity, and then we can convert our entity late bound type, use the toEntity method, which takes a generic type and pass in our entity. Mine's obviously got my prefix and underscore data type. So now we've got access to both the early bound version and the late bound version. Sorry, late bound version and the early bound version. So we can, if I now show you, if I just type early bound entity dot those, if I look under the STEG, we can see the different field names that I showed you earlier within CRM. So our date and time, lookup contact, and so on. Where if we wanted to reference a field within entity, we can put obviously square brackets, and then we literally have to know the logical name of it. So it makes it a little bit more difficult to remember exactly what the names of the attributes are. You'd have to obviously be flicking back and forth to CRM unless you knew the system very well to know the exact spelling and what attributes you had on that particular entity. And then well, we'll show you as we go on now about the issues with type safety and writing the wrong data types to those fields. So okay, so we've now got a late bound type, and we've cast that also to an early bound type. So now we can look at obviously reading in the values and writing to them. So starting off with, if I look at the form, go back to my single record I've created. So the first one is the single line of text. So that will be a string type. So if I just call this string name, and we can say if we want to use the late bound version, and it's obviously got a name of stg underscore name. And if I try to end that, you can see the IntelliSense isn't happy because the return type of this will be object. So we have to cast it, and we have to know exactly what type that contains. So again, we can either say as string, obviously if it was incorrect and that contains, say, date time, this would return null. Or if we did string beforehand and got rid of that bit of code, that would try to cast. So if that was obviously the date field, at compile time with late bound types, it doesn't know. There's no checking. It's unable to tell because that's an object. So that could be a valid cast, but you won't know until you run the plugin, and then it throws the exception that you actually tried to cast a date time into a string, which isn't a valid cast. So if I'll just put that back. I mean, this isn't going to fix the fact that we've referenced the wrong data type there, but it would return null, so name would return, but which obviously then could give you incorrect logic further on depending on how you were handling it. But we'll put that back for now. So that's how to read in using late bound, a string type. So if I just call and declare another string variable, and now we can use our early bound entity type dot steg, and this has the schema names. So you saw some of them had capital at the start, but this was the primary field and I didn't change the case. But now we can see if we hover over that property, it's got a known type of string. So if we try to put that into a date time, we'd know, well, it wouldn't allow us to compile it basically because it knows, with it being early bound, what the data types are. So there are advantages to using early band. There's a small performance hit in serializing the early band type back to a late band type across the network, but it's fairly negligible, and it speeds up the process of writing the code and ensuring it's correct, it's type safe, and you know that you're writing and reading and writing the correct types. So that's the string, like the single line of text data field type. What I'll do now is we'll build this, we'll deploy it, we'll put a breakpoint in attached to our server and step in and see this value being read back out of the attribute collection. What we'll probably have to do as well as part of the deployment is create this pre-entity image and add a little bit of code back up here to read in the value types, because unless we go and edit that field every time, it wouldn't be part of the update message, and this is a pre-existing record now because we've already saved it, so everything else now is subsequent updates. So the plugin registration tool, in the SDK tools folder, you'll see a plugin registration folder. If we double click that, scroll down, you'll see this plugin registration exe. Double click it, loads the plugin registration tool. We create a new connection. Mine's on premise 2015. Seems to somehow have I've got the right folder, haven't I? Yep. Must have these stored in the registry or somewhere. Display a list of organisations, log in. It's found a single organisation and logged straight into it. So we can now see some Microsoft assemblies that are already registered, and we can, if I build this, build solution. Oh, what I do need to do, sorry, is I need to strongly sign it before I can deploy. All plugins and workflow assemblies have to be strongly signed, so if I wait for that to finish building, it shouldn't take too long. Sorry about that. I tried to build it, and the NuGet package, the XRM SDK and so on, the DLLs, they target the very latest version of .NET Framework 4.5.2. If I look at my project, I've just changed it whilst the video was paused. It was defaulted to .NET Framework 4.5. I didn't even have an option for 4.5.2. I had to actually download the developer pack for that and install it, change my project to this type. Then when I've now tried to build it, I get obviously errors because I haven't added system runtime serialization. So if I right click on references under my project, go up to assemblies and framework, which is the standard .NET framework, and system runtime serialization, and OK, save that and try and build again. Hopefully, so now it's successfully built. What I was saying before I paused the video, you need to strongly sign any assemblies that you upload to CRM. So if I right click the project and properties, on the left hand side you can see this signing section, and at the bottom there's a tick box for sign the assembly, and then you have to choose a key file. Obviously if you don't have one, we can generate a new, which is what I'm doing. So we can just call it just key file or whatever you want. So CRM 2015 key file, and then I won't password protect it. OK, so now that assembly is strongly signed, which obviously controls assembly versioning and who the author was and so on. So if I build again, obviously you might notice most things have closed down. I'm going to have to reopen the plugin registration tool because when I installed the .NET framework, it required a reboot. So if I go back to my D drive in my instance where my SDK is extracted, so this will be wherever you've extracted the sample SD or the preview SDK, tools, plugin registration exe. Okay, so create a new connection. Hopefully it's got my previous, so it's got all my details saved. So on-premise in my instance, my server name, Active Directory, my username, password and domain, login. You should see the 3 assemblies from Microsoft that are already in the organization. So it's logging in, retrieving the messages and the assemblies and so on. So we've now built our assembly. So now we can see the pre-existing ones. If we go to register, new assembly, browse to, so in my instance it's in my documents, Visual Studio projects, CRM 2015 plugin solution, but yours will be called whatever you called it. Then my plugin assembly bin, we're in debug at the top if you look there in Visual Studio, so debug, and there's my plugin. So if I click on open, it's recognised it, it's selected the assembly to register, so we can then choose whether we register it sandbox or no isolation. If you're online you'll have to register it sandbox, and then typically I always register in the database because it's the recommended location, because it obviously moves around, it moves with the organization database, and if you've got a load balance environment it will be deployed automatically to all front-end servers. So I'll deploy it for now in a non-sandboxed in my instance, because I can easily identify which process it is for the purposes of debugging, whereas the sandbox can have multiple threads, multiple processes started, but you can debug on either one of those. So register selected plugin. So get a dialog, one assembly registered, one plugin registered, OK that. We can now see our plugin, and if I actually highlight the plugin itself, the class library, and then register new step, so we're going to register this on both a create and an update. So if I start to type create, primary entity, stg data type, don't need a secondary entity. We're going to do this, doesn't really matter, but we'll do it post operation. Doesn't matter in this instance because we're not really, actually no, sorry, we'll do it pre-operation because we're going to write values back, so ignore what I just said. So yeah, we'll do it pre-operation, that way we can manipulate an attribute and we don't have to do sort of subsequent updates and cause infinite loops and trap for the infinite loops with context.depth trapping and so on. So if we do it pre-op, we can write back to the values, let them be committed on the main database operation, and that's it, and we haven't got to do subsequent updates. So register new step. So now we've registered the create step, go back to our plugin, register another new step, and message type is an update. Again, our entity name, and now we need to trigger the filtering attributes, but we'll leave it on all because it's just a demo entity, so we're not bothered if the modified on triggered it, so in this instance, so, or any of the other fields. That was just an example. So we'll leave it on all attributes. Typically you would just select the attributes you want to be the trigger, so if it was, I don't know, a particular date time was the trigger for your plugin, you'd filter it down to just that particular attribute. So again, pre-operation, and we register. It's synchronous, not async. And then we can now do our pre-entity or post-entity image as well. So on our update step, if we highlight it rather, click on register new image, and what the image is a snapshot of the values prior to or post our manipulation of them, or so in this instance it's a pre-operation, so we're going to do a pre-image. We'll just call it pre-image. You can call it whatever you like. Again, the entity alias, call the same, and then what parameters we want the image to contain. So I'll pick our custom one, so we'll deselect all, because whatever this contains we're going to read into our entity late band type, and these will get written back each time as part of the message. So we wouldn't want all of them there because it will try to write back created ons and created bys, and it'll create a bit of a, well, it's inefficient anyway. So our custom ones are these ones with steg in the name. That's order by type. So currency, date and time, decimal number, floating point number, our lookup, our name field, our option set, and our whole number. So now we're going to have an pre-entity image called pre-image containing those values. So we can then look at which ones the entity that's been updated contains. If it doesn't contain these, we can add them in. So register the image, and that's done. I'll minimize that for now. So coming back over to Visual Studio, after we read our entity late bound type in from the input parameters, after that logic we can also do a check and say if context dot, so we need to check whether it can, oh sorry, not input parameters, pre-entity images. So similar to the input parameters containing a target, we'll also check the pre-entity images container if it contains one called the name we just gave it, which is pre-image. Obviously if you did give it a different name, you can choose that. So if it does, we'll do our pre-entity actually we'll do it in one go. So we'll take our pre-entity image called pre-image, and we'll cast it to an entity type because this will be a return type of object. So now we've got our late bound entity type, which is passed in as part of the message. So if only one value was updated, that's all this attributes collection of that entity would contain. So we'll take our pre-entity image and we'll iterate over all of the attributes within it, which is all our custom attributes, checking if this contains them. If it doesn't contain them, we'll add them in. So it'll add in the missing ones. So if we do a for each, excuse my typing, so var attribute in pre-entity image attributes collection, so it's going to go through all of the attributes. If entity attributes contains, so if it doesn't contain that particular attribute's key value, so that's the name of it, we'll add it into the entity. So that's saying if it does contain, so we need to do the exclamation mark, which is if not, or you could do equals false false. Sorry, equals false. So you could do it that way without the exclamation mark, which is the same, or this is like a negate, like a negative operator. So if it doesn't contain that, is what it's saying. It reverses it. Then entity attribute key equals attribute value. So it'll go over the pre-entity image and add in to entity, taking the name of the attribute and putting its value to equal the same. And obviously in the case of the create, this wouldn't contain the pre-image, so this bit of code will just be passed over. And then when it gets cast, you'll have an early bound type that will contain all of the values from the pre-entity image. So let me just build this again, because we need to obviously re-update it. So on that assembly plugin, you can see it's build succeeded. If we update, load it again, you see it's got the latest time I've just built it. Tick them all and update selected. Take a second or two, and now you can see one assembly updated. So minimize that. Okay, so we'll now attach the debugger. So if I go to debug, attach to process, mine's obviously in in this qualifier I've typed in my server name, which is this CRM 2015, hit return. It's discovered the remote debugger on my server, which is another download if you haven't already got that deployed, and will give me a list of all the processes. Because we didn't do it sandbox, or I didn't do it sandbox rather, I can connect to this W3WP, which is where the plugin will be executed, and hit attach. So I'm now attached to that worker process. I need to put a breakpoint in, so we could put it quite early on. I'll do one after the iteration over the pre-entity image as well, so we can skip over once we've shown that it steps in there. The reason I want to jump over stuff once we've sort of proven it's working is there's a 2-minute limit, and if we exceed that, the platform will terminate the plugin. So now it hasn't loaded the symbols yet because we haven't loaded the plugin into memory yet. So if I go back to my CRM and go to my custom entity and I open the record I did earlier, it's a bit slow because obviously I haven't accessed this since I rebooted earlier after the .NET framework. Okay, so if I open my record, so the only code we've done at the moment is we're going to create all the web services and so on, and get the entity and the pre-entity, and get the attributes. And then we just read out the name from the late bound type and the early bound type. We're not writing anything back. We're not reading any of the values at this point. So as long as we update anything to cause this plugin to trigger, so we could edit the actual name, just put, I don't know, 2 on the end, and hit save, and we should now, when we hit save, it's saving, it should now load the symbols, and it's gone into our breakpoint. So now we can start to step over the code. So you can see it does fulfill that, it gets the entity type, there's a pre-entity image, so now it's going to try and iterate over, so I'll skip over that, and we can see in the attributes collection we've got 14 attributes with modified ons and stuff, but our various fields have been read in. You can see they've all got values. So now we can step over and look at this entity steg name attribute. It's read it in test name 2, and also if I hover over the early bound type, we can also see it contains the same. If I hover over the early bound type, we can also see that it contains under here the various values like the boolean, true, and so on. So we've proven that our logic works, and we can see that we've read in correctly, losing late bound, how to read a string in. So I'll let that run on so it doesn't throw an exception. So that's continued and finished the save. It's committed obviously any changes and so on, but we only changed the number 2. So we can detach, and now we'll look at the other data types. So if I go back to my CRM, so the next data type we'll work down the form is our option set, which is called steg underscore option set in my instance, but yours will have your prefix. So an option set, if I were to look at my early bound type and do my steg option set and hover over it, you'll see that the return type, or rather that the type of that property, is an option set value, and that has a value property which is an integer, which relates to, if I edit my form, so when you look at an option set, it has a label and a value. What gets through, so if I click on double click option set, what was going on there, sorry. So details and edit, this will take me to the customization area. So we can see, if I highlight one of them, it's got a label which is what you see and the user sees, but the value is, this is the integer value that we get, that gets returned, or that when you want to set it, you have to use the integer value, you can't use the label. So if I set up a integer option set value equals entity, put the name in, which is just the lowercase logical name, which is option set in my case. So that's going to have a return type of object, and we need to cast that. Obviously we know that it's, when we looked at the early bound type, it's of type option set value, and again that's obviously can't be cast into an integer. So if we surround the whole thing in brackets and take the value property, so we've now targeted a particular attribute, our option set. It's an object type, we cast it to our option set value type, and then we can take the value property and pass that into our option set value. Likewise, if we do option set value early, I'll just do EB for early bound. That looks a bit long-winded. So now we can take our early bound entity type dot option set. Again, you can see the IntelliSense doesn't like it because we're trying to pass the option set value into our integer, but we can now directly target the value property. Let me just take the breakpoint out. So now we can. What I'll do, I'll rebuild this. Go back to our plugin registration tool. You can see it should be built successfully any second. By the time I click on update and load the assembly, it's finished building. Update the selected plugin. Take a couple of seconds. So that's finished updating. Minimize our registration tool. Attach our debugger to my W3WP process again. Attach. You'll see it hasn't loaded the symbols because the new version of the plugin hasn't been loaded yet. Go back here. We can just change that name back again. Hit save. Did that save? It didn't hit our breakpoints. Let me just rebuild solution from scratch. Go back to our plugin, update, pick our plugin again, update it. It's updated. Attach our debugger. Okay, we'll try triggering it again. Hit save. Okay, this time it stepped in. Okay, so we can step down. We can see our name is read out correctly, and now our option sets from the late bound type. We can see if you hover over value, it's got that integer value 990230001, and also our early bound version reads out as well. And if we want to update that value in code, so I've just stopped the debugger with a string. So what I'll do here is I'll show you how to write it back. If you want to target the late bound version, you simply do entity, attribute name, and the new value. And if you wanted to use the early bound version, it's just early bound entity, pick the property name, and put the new value. So whichever you prefer. I say there are advantages to early bound in that it's type safe, as we discussed earlier. I won't go over it again, but obviously what you'll see there is if we were to build this and upload it, it would do that, but it would then immediately do this. So this would be the winning piece of code, because this happens after the first bit. So they're both valid, but the actual value would end up being changed in code too. So to set what I'll do is I'm going to work predominantly from here on out. When I write them back, I'm going to use the early bound type, the early bound method rather. I just think it's easier, and we can guarantee type safety, but it's showing you there how you could do it late bound. So early bound entity dot option set equals, and this is expecting a type of option set value. So we can do new option set value, open brackets. You can see it's an overloaded method as one of two. Go down to number 2. It's expecting an integer value if you want to do it in an inline declaration. So as long as I pick a value in there that's valid for one of the options, it won't throw an exception. So it just expects an integer value. So what you could do is create an enum with the values contained within. If you wanted to store them in code, the danger is though if options get added, your enum won't contain them. So there is an include in the SDK under the sample code, I think it is, C# CRM SVC util extensions. There's a generate pick list enums, and what that does, this bit of code, I think you open the solution and build it, and then it generates a little executable. When you run it, it uses the CRM SVC util to generate a class library with all of the option sets in the entire solution as a class library, then you can reference them. But for the purposes of this, I'm just going to look at the option set field, get one of the values, and we'll change it in code. So if I double click it, details and edit, I'll just change it to the option 3. So I'll copy it with the commas, obviously they're not valid. So it's currently option 2, and we're going to just take out the commas. We're going to update it to the value of 3. Obviously they start at 0, which is why option 1 is ending 0, option 2 ends 1, and option 3 ends with 2. So obviously a little bit confusing, but that's why that value ends with a number 2. So that would then, because this is pre-operation, change that value to be option 3, and obviously the title will change to end up being changed in code too. So if I build that again, actually I'll rebuild because it sometimes doesn't break into the debugger properly. Try that again. Update. Okay, don't know what was going on there, sorry. Pick both, update selected. It's updated, minimize that, attach to the W3WP, and then we'll go and update one of the values. So I'll just change this back to nothing, hit save, hit our breakpoint, it's read in the name, it's now written back the name. So if you look here, name will currently contain stg name, can change in code, and the next line of code overwrites that's changed in code too. So we read out the option set value, which is ends in a 1. We write back our number 2, continue the code. Now you can see it's took our second entry and it's written our option set value to update it to option 3. So moving on, next field is our boolean. So we know it's obviously going to be a boolean because we don't know it is. I've labelled it boolean because I know it's a boolean because it's a 2 option value. So bool, this is a protected keyword. I'll just give it a weird name, like boolean with a capital E. I thought you've got to be careful about using protected keywords. So again, we can read it out using late bound, and we'd have to either cast it at the front or as boolean at the end. Obviously when we look at the early bound type now, you'll see steg boolean. If we hover over it, we can see it's a bool. Oh, sorry, I've been I should put in bool here, not boolean. Excuse me for that. Yeah, it's of type bool, and it's a nullable type. So yeah, that's why even though we've declared bool, the return type is actually bool with a question mark, which shows it can be nullable. So if you want to get just the value of it, you do use the dot value property, but potentially it could be if the field was created after a record was already created in the system. So our existing record was there. If we added the Boolean field in after the record was created, the value in the database would be null until we got in and set it for the first time, which is why it's a nullable type. But if we do value, it can either only be true or false returned. So we'll also set it back to, so I'll use the early band type. We'll set it back to false because I think it's currently true. So again, build, rebuild it, go to our plugin registration tool. Oops, sorry. Sorry, I can't do. I think that was what it was griping about. Let's just build again. Okay, that's okay this time. It didn't like me using the as operator for the Boolean. So go back to the plugin update, load it from my project folder, select it, update selected, it's updated, minimize, attach. Okay, pick our W3WP. Attach to the server. I'll move the breakpoint down to the new bit of code down here. Save stepping through it all again. So go back to our record. I'll change this back to option 1. I'll just put test in there. We can see our Boolean is currently yes. So when I hit save, hits our breakpoint, we read in our value, which is true. Our early band value is also true, obviously it's the same field, and now we're going to set it to false and let the main database operation commit it. So we can now see it's changed that, it's changed that to 3 and it's changed it to false. So I'll do all of the next ones in one go, rather than, so otherwise this video is going to end up being a couple of hours long and you'll be bored to tears. So the next one on our list is the whole number, which is going to be obviously an integer. Whole, I can't spell. Whole number equals int entity square brackets steg underscore whole number, and whole number EB equals early bound entity dot scroll down to find our whole number. So already it's again, it can be null, so it's a nullable type, so we need to use the value property. If it was null, obviously you'd need to, if you're doing checks and processing it, you'd have to check if it was a null value before you went and started trying to read the value property, because obviously it could give you either an exception or incorrect results if you start using the value property. If it was to give you, I don't know if it gives you an initialized value or if it throws an exception. If you try to get the value property if it was actually null, I think you'd probably get an exception. So again, we'll update that. What you'll notice is we can actually set it outside of the range, because that had a range of 0 to 100. We could actually set it to 110, and because those validations are only done client side, it's not actually like server level back-end validation. So I'll just show you this one. Let's just build and update. Select all of those. Minimize. I'll set the breakpoint just there. Attach. W3WP again, and then we'll go and just put some rubbish in there, change that back to 1, change that back to yes. So it's 55 at the moment. Hit save. It didn't hit our breakpoint, but you can see it's changed it to encode 2 option 3 no. It's actually changed to 110. That's actually a saved record, so we can go back to data types and it come back in, and it allowed it to be outside of the range of 0 to 100. Obviously, if the user was to try and do the same, it will give them a validation error and they can't save it, but code can actually set it outside of the acceptable range. So be aware of that when you're writing values. What I'll do now is I'll pause the video, add code for the remaining types, and I'll go through them rather than you watching me typing the code out. Hi, yeah, welcome back. Yeah, just spent a few minutes writing out the rest of them, so you didn't have to watch me write it and build it and deploy it and so on. So we got to, I think, whole number, and then the next one is the floating number, which is the data type is a double. So if you see me hover over the early bound type, it's a double. And again, virtually all the data types are nullable types because they can also have null values, which is how CRM identifies them as not having anything in them. So in order to read, so we read out, we can cast it to a double, and then with the early bound type, there's a value property which gives us the actual double value. I think you'll find if we were to have a null value in any of these and try and use the value property, we'd get an exception. So you'd probably have to check as to whether it whether it was set to null before you attempted to get the value property. I mean, we can try that in a second. We'll set it to nothing and run the plugin and see if it throws an exception. So that's the floating point. Write it back. You just pass a floating point value, a double value in. Decimal, obviously you return a decimal type. Again, nullable type with a value property. When you set it, you have to tell it that it's a decimal by putting the capital M at the end. If I take that away, and it classes it as a double, and then you get the IntelliSense issue. So the capital M identifies it as a decimal. Date time is always, regardless of whether it's a date only or date and time, as the CRM value, they always return as date times. So again, I've just shown there's another method available. This get attribute value of the entity type. It's exactly the same as referencing it using the square brackets with the key value. This get attribute value, you just obviously give it the generic type and it gets the value of that attribute. I think it may handle better the if it's a nullable type, but we can try it in a second. The value property, because it's a nullable, again, nullable date time value. We'll get the early bound version. When setting it back, obviously you have to pass it a date time. So I've just done a new date time in memory of Christmas Day at 3:30 in the afternoon and 45 seconds. Again, date and time, same thing. I've done the same. You could just as easily have done the square brackets. Both will work, so I'll just show you both. Again, nullable type, and then I've set a value back as New Year's Eve at 4:21. But we can see when we read that back in, it actually does store the time, even though the value that's shown on the form is only the date portion. It does actually store that in the database. Then the currency type is a CRM type of money. It doesn't store anything about the actual currency. That's done. The currency itself is stored in the currency lookup field. This is just a money type that has a decimal type you have to pass in if you want to declare a new one. So when you've got that money type, it has actually got a dot value property, which is a decimal type. So if I were to now say money, either one of them, it's got a dot value property, and if we look at it, it's a decimal. So then when you're writing a new one or updating existing, you have to declare it as a money type and pass in It's got one overload, which is a decimal value. Again, you have to use the capital M to write to it. Then the final one is a lookup field. Lookups are what are called entity references, and an entity reference has two parts, three parts. It has the entity logical name. So if I press F12 on that, go to the declaration, has a logical name, a name, has it got the properties for this? So, and a GUID. So the name is the friendly name, so like Steve Green is the name. The logical name would be contact in this instance, and then the GUID is the ID. So when we read that in, that property that the lookup now has an ID, which is the GUID, logical name, which is the entity, and then the name of it, which would be the person's name, the primary field. And then when we write one back, we've got, I think this is it one or two, just one overload, I think. Yeah, so we pass it the logical name and the GUID. So I've created an extra contact, gone and got the GUID for the contact, and pasted that in there so we can update it to a different contact when we write it back. So when you write it back, you say a new entity reference, and then it expects the logical name. We can either use a string there, or if you've got the early bound class library, I could do contact dot entity logical name, and that way I don't need to know exactly what it's called. But obviously if you know already what the entity is there, chances are you're going to know what the logical name is, which is the lowercase version. So both are valid, both acceptable, because they both just return, well, the entity.logical name is a string. So if I build that, I'll move this breakpoint down to where we got to. Build that, go back to our plugin registration tool, update, pick our new plugin selector, update. OK that, minimize that, attach to the W3WP process again. And then trigger our, let's go back to my data types record. So you can see it's currently the 12th of March, 12th of April. I think these are in, let me just change my format, sorry. It's actually December. Formats. So change it to United Kingdom. It should refresh the form. Okay, so it's refreshed. So we can see they currently contain 3rd and 4th of December, and one's got a time component, currency value, 600 and something pounds, and me as the contact. So if I just change this, I'm not going to set them back again, but just change one that will trigger it. Save. You can see it didn't step into our code, but I'll go back and we'll do it again. But you can see it put the floating point number in as per the 123, but obviously it's only 2 DP we've set on the form, so it's rounded it up. Same with the decimal, we put this very long decimal precision in, it's rounded that up because we've set it to 2 DP. Again, the date, it's set it to our Christmas, and obviously we put a time component as well. What we'll do, we'll trigger it again and we'll check that that's got the time component as well stored, even though the user only sees the date component, and it's got our 4:21 PM. It also updated our £678 to our 54478, and then it updated our entity reference to my other contact that I created, which was Bill Gates. Let me just detach and rebuild. So it does this quite frequently, where unless you rebuild the whole solution, when you update it, it doesn't always break into the code, step into the code. So let's update again. Okay, that's updated. So I'll attach to the W3WP again. Bit of a delay. Okay, so attached to the process, and hopefully this time it will hit the code. If I just change, let me just change that to 12. Well, that'll do. That'll be our change. It's auto saved, which has triggered it. So if we look at the date time field we were interested in, so you see it does actually contain 3:30 and 45 seconds, even though the user only sees the date component. You can see on these, if you look at the expand it out, you can see it's got a logical name, a name, and a GUID, an ID property, which is the GUID. The reason it has on the entity reference the logical name, which isn't, you don't actually need to specify it. If it's just a single lookup, but obviously it's best practice to specify the valid. You could put null there, but there's certain CRM standard entities that have multi-entity lookups, like customer fields on opportunities and and invoices that could be contacts, accounts, and many other field types. So the reason you specify the entity logical name is that it's good practice that if it does target multiple, it will accurately and correctly and won't throw an exception, because you won't be able to find the entity. If it's a multi-entity lookup, the GUID wouldn't just find it. You need to tell it which entity that referred to. So that completes the video. If you've got any questions, feel free to post them below, and thanks for watching.